All right. Today's lecture is brought to you by an exciting new novel. It's called The One Donkey Solution. I wrote it, and I am pushing it. And it is available at either of the book culture outlets or on Amazon or for Kindle, whatever you want. It is the novel that will tell you pretty much everything there is to know about the sexual and religious symbolism of donkeys with respect to the coming of the Messiah. President Ahmadinejad of Iran and President Obama are both characters in the novel. And the part of the novel is actually narrated by the donkey of the Messiah, talking about what he thought of Moses and what he thought of Abraham and what he thought of Jesus, what he thought of Muhammad, and so forth. This might not seem like a terribly professional thing to do, but when I was interviewed for this job at Columbia in 1975, the chairman of the department said, "What will your next book be?" And I said, "Well, it'll be a quantitative study of conversion to Islam in the medieval period." He said, "What will your book be after that?" I said, "Well, it'll be a reconsideration of the social history of medieval Islam based upon the chronology established in the book on conversion." He said, "And what will your book be after that?" And I said, "It will be a study of the sexual and religious symbolism of donkeys." So even though it has come out in the form of a novel, it is a scholarly enterprise that I worked on for 40 years, and that was part of my promise to the chairman of the department when I applied for the job here. Now, that being said, let us talk about a chapter in The Earth and Its Peoples dealing with basically Europe from 1500 to 1700. You may have read the chapter. You may not read it yet, but you should read it before discussion sections next week. Typically, the discussion sections will discuss the chapter assigned in the preceding week. So you read the chapter, you hear the lectures, there will be some thought questions emailed to you that will give you sort of orienting things you might think about before the discussion sections in the following week. My starting point today is really the sequencing of topics. The world history textbooks in general, and indeed most of the sort of single author textbooks dealing with world history, more or less fall into the pattern of writing something about the Mongol Empire, and writing something about the European Renaissance, then writing something about the maritime expansion, the age of exploration, and then shifting back to Europe to write about the Reformation and what is called early modern Europe. And it's not really clear that that is what one needs to do. The entry of Europeans into the New World, which we'll be talking about next week, is particularly uncomfortable. When you think that you had two empires in the New World, the Incan and the Aztec empires, which we either talk about in passing as part of the European voyages of exploration, and then they're referred to as the conquest of Mexico and the conquest of Peru. But we devote an entire chapter, usually, sometimes more, to the Roman Empire and it falls, but it doesn't get conquered. The Roman Empire falls. The fall of the Roman Empire. The Incas and the Aztecs get conquered. Rome is sort of like Humpty Dumpty. It fell off the wall, and there were barbarians. But the barbarians, it's true they may have sacked Rome, as Alaric did, or Attila the Hun, but that's not the same thing as conquering Rome. Rome just falls, and we're still puzzled as to why. Whereas when it comes to the New World empires, they got their butts kicked by those Europeans, all 13 or 14 of them, and so they get conquered. We do not deal with the aftermath of that conquest except to talk about what the Europeans do after that. Now, structurally speaking, the Europeans are the barbarians attacking these empires. When historians say Rome is an empire and a civilization, and it is assaulted by barbarians, we think of those barbarians, the Vikings, the Magyars, and so forth, as being less civilized. But when it comes to the Aztecs and the Incas, their empires are described as the empires of savages. That they're the barbarians, and the Europeans are clearly the conquerors. And somehow the greatness has been transferred from the empire to the conquerors. Now, I think this is a very distorted and basically Eurocentric way of approaching this, but it fits into the idea that the story of world history since 1500 is at bottom the story of the world that the Europeans make. And therefore, those people who do not contribute to the story will gradually fall by the wayside. So the Aztecs and the Incas fall by the wayside. Eventually, the Indians and the Chinese and others will fall by the wayside until we simply have, what the West has has created. But in the era of globalization, it's not necessarily clear that the accomplishment of the West has to be the end of this story. A number of years ago, I compiled a book called The Columbia History of the 20th Century. And it was a thematic history. There were 20 chapters on different things that had made the 20th century distinctive. But they were all thematic things. For example, there was a chapter on socialism. There was a chapter on economic developments. There was a chapter on popular culture, a chapter on telecommunications, a chapter on transport, a chapter on this and that. There was no chapter on World War I or World War II or the Great Depression or the Cold War. Because those were episodes that happened in the 20th century, but in terms of fundamentally altering the way people live, I felt that these themes were more pertinent. So I got a whole bunch of people to write chapters, and some of them were pretty good, and some of them were not so good. I wrote the introduction, and I wrote the conclusion. In the conclusion, I said, what we think happened in the 20th century now, in 1999, will be completely rethought in 2099. In the same way that people who wrote about the 19th century in 1900 saw the 19th century completely differently than we see it now. They didn't see it as this period of racist, imperialist imposition of European arrogance upon the whole globe. They saw it as a period of great progress in which Europe had risen to the pinnacle of civilization and offered its gifts to the world, whether they wanted it or not. But now, 100 years later, we look back at the 19th century, and we talk about what was so terrible about things in the 19th century. So my assumption was that at the beginning of the 22nd century, people will look back at the 20th century and see it very differently. So what I had in the conclusion of the book was half dozen book proposals sent to editors in 2099, proposing a history of the 20th century from the perspective of 100 years in the future. And like one of them would say, well, since Asia has become the dominant force in the entire world, obviously the history of the 20th century is the history of the rise of Asia, in which case the European civil wars between France and England and Germany and America are really pretty damn trivial, because the important thing is China, Japan, Korea. That is what's happened in the 21st century, and therefore we have to go back and reread the 20th century in that perspective. Or an alternative was the rise to domination of the Muslim world, or the union of North and South America as an Anglo-Hispanic powerhouse, in which Brazil and the United States and Canada and Mexico run the whole world. And so they see the 20th century very much in terms of the animosity between English speakers and Spanish speakers in the Western Hemisphere, and how that developed, and how miraculously it all disappeared in the course of the 21st century as the dynamism of Western Hemisphere economies took over. In other words, I was simply trying to make a point that how you tell the story is predicated on where you were looking from, and where you were looking from changes with time, so that the main master narratives of world history as we get into the last 500 years tend to be rooted in the, let's say, mid-20th century Western suprematism. That when Europe and America still were unquestionably the, where the world had gotten to and where it was going to go, and where perhaps the biggest story was, will it be socialist communism or free enterprise that will shape the future of the world? The idea that by the time we got to, the second decade of the 21st century, most young people would not know what the Cold War was, because it was over, and socialism, communism were now sort of historical antiques, whereas global domination by one superpower was now the norm. Now, that hadn't occurred to anyone. So when you look at a chapter like this one on early modern Europe, and you see what has been selected to be in the chapter and what has been deselected, you have to ask yourself, is there any reason why anyone should know who Henry VIII was anymore? Or is there any reason why Martin Luther and John Calvin are the only Protestants who really get mentioned, other than Henry VIII. Is there any reason to know who Charles V was? Because the surprising thing, not surprising to me because I know who wrote the chapter, but the surprising thing I think in the context of thinking about world history is how much political standard Western civ has gotten into this chapter. Now that's fine. I mean, sometimes these are wonderful stories, but it also means that there's an opportunity cost, that the things that you've put in have led to things that you are leaving out. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that have been left out, with the idea that when this chapter is rewritten for the 6th edition, because I think I'll be rewriting it, it may be revamped in a strikingly different way. For one thing, Europe between 15 and 1700, as it is written in this chapter, is basically England, France, Italy, Spain. Eastern Europe plays no significant role in the chapter. Neither Southeastern Europe, although wars with the Ottoman Empire are mentioned, nor Northeastern Europe, although wars between the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation and Tsarist Russia were important at the time. This is part of a larger issue that has to do with the entire arena of historical development that encompasses the Mediterranean Sea, its borderlands, and particularly Europe to the north. If you look at Islamic history, you find that they divide it, the Muslims did, the historians did, geographers did, into the West and the East. The West was called the Maghrib, the East was called the Mashriq. And they are strikingly different areas. So the West is North Africa and Spain, and the East is, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran. So we have the Mashriq and the Maghrib, the East and the West. Interestingly, the West tends to be the land of wonder, the land of legend, the land where the history is almost completely unreliable, whereas the East is what is solidly known. Then you have Europe, and we talk about Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So we actually now have 4 quadrants. We have a Eastern Europe, and south of that, an Eastern Islamic world. Then we have a Western Europe, south of that, a Western Islamic world. And it doesn't match the boundaries of Europe. Because, for example, Spain, early on, up to 1492, would be in the Islamic West. You say, well, 1492, it is, goes back into the control of Christians. But by that time, Southeastern Europe, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, those have come under Muslim rule. So now the Southeast quadrant no longer matches the division between Europe and non-Europe. So we really have a Europe that is primarily the Northwest and the Northeast, but it doesn't even coincide with Europe. I mean, the question of what Europe is and why we should use the term probably could be raised in the same way that for the last 50 years, people in my specialty have raised a question of what is the Middle East? What is it in the middle of? It's not in the middle of anything. Where is the Middle East? Does it include this? Does it include that? An awful lot of ink has been wasted on that particular unanswerable topic. But you could raise the same thing for Europe. what is Europe? Where is Europe? Is Europe a geographical concept, or is it something that's constructed in different times according to the history that's going on? So anyway, in this chapter, it is really northwestern Europe, or rather the northwest quadrant that includes northern Europe, that gets the bulk of the attention. When it comes to humanism, those humanists are pretty much in that area. When it comes to scientific revolution, by George, Newton was an Englishman, and we should never forget it. Galileo, well, anyway, but Newton, he was an Englishman. Tycho Brahe was a Swede, which doesn't fit very well. Copernicus was a Pole. But let's stick with Newton, because after all, he's English. So we write a lot about Newton. We leave some of these other people out. What would you gain if you included some of this other stuff? Well, since a big part of this story is the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and we more or less portray the period after Martin Luther's posting of his theses on the cathedral door at Wittenberg, we more or less cast that as 100 years of war between Protestants and Catholics. What would you get if you included some other part of Europe? Well, let us say you go to 1572. 1572 is, which we do not mention in the chapter, although we could have, it's the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. That was when either the royal family of France or equally highly placed individuals, probably the Secretary of Defense, arranged to kill all of the Huguenot leaders, all the Protestant leaders. They failed to kill the primary one, Admiral Coligny, but they managed to kill thousands of others in a great slaughter in the streets. And the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre marked pretty much the end of dynamic Protestantism in France. And so it's a famous event. That's 1572. 1573 is the Warsaw Confederation. That was a document that was drawn up in Europe's largest country, which was a confederation of Poland and Lithuania that had one of the largest populations in Europe. And it was a document that was knowledgeable of what had happened in France in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And what it is a document in which all of the nobles of Poland and Lithuania agree that there should be absolute religious freedom for both commoners and the nobility, and that there should be no religious test for who rules. There should be no religious discrimination of any kind. And indeed, Poland becomes, it doesn't last, but for a century or so, Poland becomes the model of religious toleration. It also becomes the first constitutional monarchy. By constitution, they actually formally create a constitution very late in the game, in the late 1700s, but from the late 1500s on, they have a system by which the king is elected. The king is elected by the nobles. But Poland and Lithuania had more nobles than any other part of Europe. 10% of the population were counted as the nobility. And they had to elect who was going to be king. So when a king died, you would have candidates, like the French king would say, I want my brother to be king of Poland. Or the Russian Tsar would say, I want to be king of Poland. or Hungarian king say, I want to be king of Poland. And you would have basically, debates where the candidates to be king would have to sell their views to the other nobles. And the curious thing was that the vote had to be unanimous. So the polling lasted for months, and the candidates would show up at the place where the nobles would all assemble, and with an army, and say, I want to be king, and I happen to have 400 heavily armed soldiers who also think I should be king. And someone else says, yeah, but I have 500 heavily armed soldiers. So they would occasionally, get into brawls, people would be killed, fights would break out, but it actually worked. They elected kings, and the kings did not impose their religion. So Poland, in the late 1500s, unlike anywhere else in Europe, had Catholics. The Catholics hated this deal. They had probably 20 or so different varieties of Protestants, because they're Protestants, like mushrooms. They just popped out in all sorts of forms. They had Jews. The Jews were completely part of the whole deal at that time, not what they were in the 19th century. And they had Muslims. You had Muslims who were subjects of the Polish king living in Poland, and others who were allies of the Polish monarchy during one or another of the various wars that they had. To this day, in Lithuania, there is a population of Muslims that is still remaining from that era, because the idea that Islam and Christianity were necessarily hostile to one another, that was the crusading notion, which was basically a Western European notion. In Eastern Europe, Muslims were not, by definition, the enemy. And when you look, for example, at the history of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in Russia, in the middle of the 1500s, a number of wars that he participates in, he has Muslim allies. And Muslims can be in Moscow and have a mosque. I mean, it just isn't the big deal in the east, in the northeast quadrant, that it is in the northwest. Now, we've inherited the idea that the northwest is our model, and yet if we were to visualize a world in which Muslims and Christians actually got along, or let's say Muslims and post-Christians, maybe we should talk about this history that says there was a time when tolerance and acceptance were normal between Muslims and Christians. And we should stick this into the history book and perhaps have a few paragraphs left about Crusaders and Saracens beating up on each other in earlier episodes. Because one of the assumptions about any world history textbook is what is the utility of knowing this body of knowledge as opposed to some other body of knowledge. So I think there's a fundamental rethinking that needs to go into a chapter like this. That partly is just a matter of diversifying the geography, but partly it's a matter of asking, what do we need to know today about Europe, however you're defining it, and events that took place between 1500 and 1700, which we have now labeled early modern events. Early modern is an extremely slippery term because it anticipates that modern is just waiting in the wings to come on, and therefore what you should write about are those things that will be part of the modern. But are the wives of Henry VIII part of the modern? Well, of course, the Tudor series on HBO makes them part of the modern. But aside from things like that, do we need to know that? It's not clear that we do. The pressure of competing textbooks, if everybody else mentions Henry VIII, we'll probably have to as well. But nevertheless, that's a different consideration. The opportunity cost of talking about the standard Western civ things for Northwest Europe in this period extends not only to issues of religious and political importance, such as what I mentioned about Poland and Lithuania, but it also gets into the theme of the book. Now, as I said, we have two themes. Dominance and diversity is one. Okay, dominance and diversity really works for Protestants and Catholics. Each one wants to dominate the other, and the other constitutes diversity, I suppose, in some sense. Nevertheless, the theme of technology and the environment is way, way, way underplayed for this particular period in ways that prevent us from seeing how Europe in this period prefigures not the political or the cultural shape of today's world, but more the technologies that are taken for granted today. And as with so many things in technology, a lot of this has to do with war. And I'm separating here the history of science, which is talked about, and yet it's not clear how important the history of science is, quite frankly. I mean, Copernicus, let's say Galileo could see mountains on the moon, but if it had been dark every night with cloud cover, would it have made much difference whether he could see the moon or not? I mean, people are going to still lead their lives. I'm not sure astronomy is anywhere near as important as the historians of science seem to think it is. But war clearly is an important technology, not least because Europe becomes, and particularly from this period onward, probably the most warlike area in the entire globe. And if you're going to talk about European exceptionalism and what is special about Europe, you're probably going to say they kill each other more than anybody else does. And what we get to with the European Union now, here we have half a century, 60 years of not killing each other, longest period of peace in Europe since Augustus at the beginning of the Roman Empire. Europeans just aren't used to this, and I think they're not reacting very well. So what's happening in the area of war? Because that is, for Europe and for America, so much the point of genesis of new technologies or new uses of technology. There is a convention by which we call Muslim empires of this period, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Safavids. I'll talk about them in a couple of weeks. We call them gunpowder empires. It's a bad convention. I will not use it myself. I do not endorse it. It's based on a book somebody wrote that was fundamentally based on a misreading of a chronicle, and it's just nonsense. But it does point out that gunpowder becomes very important in this period. Well, actually, gunpowder is important 200 years earlier, before 1500. It's just that the way in which gunpowder weapons develop changes the nature of warfare in the 1500s and into the 1600s in ways that have somewhat less than obvious implications. In the period of the Crusades, going back to the 12th century. The European aristocracy were knights, the males. They wore armor, they rode horses, they carried a shield, they carried a lance, they carried a sword or a battle axe, and they beat up on each other whenever they could. It's sort of Game of Thrones is a good portrayal of it if you follow the television I watch. The knights disappear, and this is the time when they disappear, in the course of the 1500s. Everyone sort of grants that, well, it was gunpowder that made the knights less and less relevant. But exactly how did that happen? Because, you know, a guy wearing a thick metal costume riding down on you on a big heavy horse with a lance is going to be scary no matter what it is. I mean, if you have a gun, you say, I missed, my God, yeah, I'm dead. But the fact of the matter is that what you had at this time in the Ottoman Empire was the development of infantry units called janissaries, and I'll talk about them in a couple of weeks, that were armed with very heavy harquebuses that were guns that were so heavy that you held it to your shoulder and you had a stand in front to hold up the front end because it was just too heavy. You couldn't ride a horse and fire one. But steadily, the guns became lighter and lighter. And what you had developing in the 1500s in Europe was the idea that you could have a soldier who would carry 2 pistols. This was the idea of a cuirassier. A cuirasse was a breastplate, something covered the chest and the back. And the first cuirassiers would wear a helmet, a metal breastplate, a metal backplate, and metal above the knee on their legs in front. But they would sit on a horse. They wouldn't have any metal on their butt. And the lower, below the knee, they would wear long boots. By 1600, the armor is becoming less and less and less because they need to move faster, and they're heavy, and the armor isn't necessarily protecting them that much. So gradually it becomes simply a breastplate and a backplate and maybe some kind of a helmet. They carry 2 pistols, and they develop a technique known as the carriages, where they ride their horse toward the enemy line. They have the horse shy to the left, and then they shoot with their right-hand pistol. Then they have the horse shy to the right. They shoot with their left-hand pistol, and then they pivot around and go back. And the next tier comes up and shoots their pistols. Dramatically different from what a knight does. A knight is galloping forward in order to make contact, whereas these cuirassiers, and there were other formations that did the same thing, dragoons, for example, they were riding forward to close distance on the enemy to get within firing distance quickly, fire, and then retreat. So the nobility of killing someone with a club right up close, that nobility was being diminished. And these people who were firing pistols were not nobles. They were more or less an elevated lower level of the army rather than the nobility coming down to this level of activity. Shortly thereafter, by the time you get to the 18th century or well into the 17th century, you start to have musketeers. because the musket is a new type of long weapon that is much more accurate than these pistols. It was very questionable whether anyone ever hit anything with these pistols, because the pistols were extremely inaccurate. In those days, a pistol would often sort of go out at the end like a trumpet or something, and the ball that it fired would go down the barrel, bounce, 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 and go out in some direction or other. But the idea that it would go in a straight line was just wishful thinking. So some armies didn't believe in this sort of thing, but a lot of them did. So during these wars of religion, you had a change in technology that pushed in the direction of horse riders carrying firearms against infantry formations that carried long spears called pikes, like 17 feet long, so that the person in the front row of pikes would be kneeling on the ground and holding his pike out at an angle, anchored into the ground. The one behind him would holding his pike straight forward, going over his shoulder, and so forth. And the idea was that if the horses come too close, they'll hit the pikes and they will shy away. So you were going from having warfare conceptualized as, face-to-face bludgeoning one another with axes and swords and hammers and so forth, to more of a standoff thing, where you don't necessarily presume that you were going to get into that final hand-to-hand combat. Although, if you had one pike force against another, then you would have what was known as push of pikes, where the two groups would just push at each other and see which one could push harder and kill more. But all of this began to diminish the role of the knight. It no longer had the nobility that it had before. Knights continued to exist. Their armor became increasingly ceremonial, used for jousts or for parading. Jousting armor, for example, was often made without the flexibility to actually be used in battle, because jousting became a separate activity that had derived from warfare but was no longer part of the warfare. Now, what did it mean if the aristocracy were no longer defining themselves as being knights prepared to ride into battle with lance and armor and strike against the enemy? Well, for one thing, it made horseback riding less of a marker of social status than it had been for the 1,000 years prior to this time. In other words, between the time of the decline of the chariot, and that was in last year's course, and the rise of gunpowder, horse-borne gunpowder, the knight was a mounted, armored warrior, and a man who did not ride a horse really couldn't be thought of as a nobleman. The best example of this, and I mentioned this last year, as nobody will recall, was a famous old French poem by Chrétien de Troyes from the 12th century called The Knight of the Cart. In that, it's an Arthurian story, and in the story of the Knight of the Cart, Queen Guinevere is kidnapped by an evil person. So the call goes out to the Knights of the Round Table, who will go and recover Queen Guinevere from this evil captivity. And a number of knights sort of leap out and run out, get on their horses, and head off to rescue Guinevere. Among them is Lancelot. Lancelot not only is doing it for honor, but because he's personally crazy mad in love with Guinevere. He gets into a fracas on his way to rescue her, and he loses his horse. Now he's so eager to find her that when a farmer comes by with a cart, he hops on the cart and rides off to pursue his quest. He now becomes known as the Knight of the Cart, the knight who shamed himself by sitting in a vehicle, because for a nobleman to ride in a cart was a source of profound shame, because carts in that period, 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, carts were farmers' vehicles. They were used for crops and bringing in goods, from the village. And for a nobleman to get in a cart was simply wrong. And it was a source of shame. It wasn't just wrong in the abstract, but it made you notorious for having shamed your entire status as a knight. So Lancelot becomes a knight of the cart, and it's a source of shame. Now you get to the end of knighthood, and what happens? Men are able to ride in vehicles. You think, well, surely they can always ride in vehicles. Well, of course they could if they were very old, like me, or if they were ill, or if they were a divinely ordained king, they might ride in a vehicle. But basically, vehicles were for farmers and women. And for a man to get in a vehicle, say prior to 1500, in Western Europe, was simply wrong. Now, oddly enough, starting around 1400, there had been dramatic changes in the nature of vehicles. And those changes don't get written about because they occurred in Hungary instead of in Western Europe. But in Hungary, you had invented a kind of vehicle called a coach, which is from a Hungarian word, place name, city of Koch. And then this developed, not directly, but this becomes expressed more in English by the word carriage. So carriages come into being in the 1400s in Eastern Europe. Interestingly, they also get used, wagons get used for warfare in Eastern Europe at this time. And the notion of circling the wagons, where you have some wagons that you take to battle, and then you arrange them in a circle or a square, and you fight for the protection of the wagons. That concept originated in the late 1300s with the followers of the early sort of proto-Protestant leader Jan Hus in the Hussite Wars, where they had circling the wagons. And in Poland and Hungary, from that time on, having your military depend upon basically a portable fort consisting of a circle of wagons becomes a standard tactic. These are called lagers, or they're called tabors. There are various terms for them. The old, it eventually comes to be used in South Africa in the Boer War. It's used in America for the pioneers to circle the wagons against the attacking Indians, so forth and so on. This is when that tactic originates. You circle the wagons, and you get either in the wagons or behind the wagons with your firearm, and you shoot in between. Once you get cannon, you can have the cannon shoot from between the wagons. And this is the sort of portable fortress. It's not used in Western Europe. So that part, the military part of it, does not carry over into Western Europe. But the other technical developments do. And I'm not going to get into detail because I'm teaching a seminar on the history of wheeled vehicles that nobody is attending. And if anyone wants to go to an undergraduate senior seminar on the history of wheeled transport, I have lots of room in the seminar. But this is when you have brakes invented and steering mechanisms and suspension and the concept of the separation between body and chassis. Essentially, you go from a very primitive kind of vehicle, circa 1000 or 1100. By 1500, you have a pretty fancy and technically developed vehicle. But in 1500, it still isn't dignified for a man to ride in that vehicle. So in Eastern Europe, you get carriages that high status men will ride in, but not in Western Europe. Queen Elizabeth, when she went from one place to another, the goods that she carried with her for her entourage and her upkeep and so forth would fill a couple of hundred carts, two-wheeled baggage vehicles. But she would ride on a horse. And then then there was a nobleman in England in the middle of the 1500s who ordered a carriage to be built in Holland and imported it into England. And then Queen Elizabeth thought, I could have one of those. In fact, I could have 3 of those. And so she got carriages. And then, lo and behold, by the early 1600s, London was crammed with carriages. It is absolutely extraordinary. The growth of the carriage industry parallels the motor car explosion of the early 20th century and the steam railroad explosion of the early 19th century, that you went from having almost all passenger transport being by horseback to having it be increasingly by carriage. This revolution, it's interesting, when we get to the Industrial Revolution, we'll talk about how important railroads are. So you have steel for the rails and steel for the steam engines. Or we'll talk about how important motor cars are to industrialization. But in fact, the carriage industry, with all of its different particular designs of vehicles, prefigures everything that's going to happen later, and yet it's left out of world history. All right, you don't have to put in everything in world history, but what are the implications of a carriage industry? Well, let's say in the development of steering, let's suppose you had a 4-wheeled wagon. If you want to turn that wagon, you have a problem because the wheel is going to run into the bed of the wagon. So even if you're pivoting the front axle, you can only pivot it maybe 5 degrees, depending on how wide the axle is, before it hits the edge of the wagon, the edge of the wagon bed. That's known as a full lock position, when the wheel comes in contact with the wagon bed. However, if you design like this and you make your front wheel of a small diameter, then you can pivot the front axle and the wheel will go underneath the bed of the wagon. And so one of the clear things that you look at in images of wheel transport from the 14th century onward is, what is the relative size of the back wheels and the front wheels? If the front wheels are noticeably smaller, it means that they're steering the thing. Whereas if the wheels are of exactly the same size and clearly interfering with the bed of the 4-wheeled vehicle, then it means that they don't have a steering system, which means they can't use it in a city. Because if you can't steer it, a 4-wheeled vehicle, it's sort of like those shopping carts that have 1 or 2 frozen wheels. You're trying to turn it, and you just can't do it. Finally, you pick the damn thing up and shove it over, because turning a 4-wheeled vehicle, if you can't steer it, is just extremely slow. You wear it in a very, very large turning radius. So prior to steering, you couldn't have a carriage in town because you couldn't turn it, or not a carriage. You couldn't have a four-wheeled passenger vehicle in town because you couldn't turn it. The towns were not big enough to have space to turn the vehicle. And you couldn't really have it in the country very well because there were no paved roads. And that becomes a problem here. The smaller the diameter of the wheel, the smoother the road has to be, because the ability of the wheel to simply go over a rough surface is proportional to the size of the wheel. It's like, rollerblading on a brick street or across country through a forest is something you don't usually do because the wheels are too small. And yet you could have a mountain bike and go across country because the wheel is so much bigger. So when they start to steer it, then they reduce the size of the front wheel, and then they have to improve the surface of the road that the vehicle goes on. So now, in the 1600s, you're starting to get cities in Western Europe, earlier in Eastern Europe, that have passenger vehicles in it and are beginning to have paved streets. They're becoming more like a city that we would identify. You go back, say, to Renaissance art and look at pictures of Rome and other places, and you say, well, this is really kind of open country studded with ruins of Roman this and that. But there are no roads. There are just sort of tracks through this ruin. But now you begin to say, well, a city needs to have a layout of streets because there are vehicles that have to pass through those streets. And so you have to consider, what is paving? How do you pave a street in a way that actually works? History of pavement is really interesting, and I'm not going to go into it. In preparing for this seminar, I've learned more about the detailed history of asphalt than I had ever thought that I would know, and I've been trying to forget it ever since I read the book. But it is very important because your vehicle technology and your paving technology are moving along parallel. The better, the lighter, the more efficient your vehicles, the more you need a better pavement. So now you're beginning to have a substantially greater separation between life in the city and life in the countryside. The countryside has mud right down to, let's say, the middle of the 19th century. I think that at the time of World War I, the United States had something like 20,000 miles of paved road outside of cities. Otherwise, we simply didn't have paved roads in the United States that far into the 20th century. And if it rained, that meant you had mud. And it rains all the time in Europe. So I mean, it's really the mud zone where every account of people trying to go cross country in wheeled vehicles in the 1600s is just studded with these terrible stories of being mired down to the floorboards in mud. You have monarchs who are traveling by carriage from one major city in their realm to another, who tip over several times in the course of the trip because the roads are so incredibly bad. So the life of the city is now separating in a technological fashion from the life of the country. You can get around the city, but it's very hard to get anywhere outside the city. Not only that, but now the cities can grow in size. Prior to having the vehicles so readily at hand in the city, you could ride a horse, of course, if you had one, but But largely, these cities were pedestrian scale. Now you can begin to develop things on the outskirts of the city because you have carriages. But perhaps as important as any of these things, because this is mostly technological innovation that is utilized by the elite, by the noble class, what you have is the idea that your ride tells people who you are. You see somebody's carriage and say, oh, that's the Duke of Norfolk, because I'd recognize his carriage. Because, see, if you were a knight, you had your coat of arms on your shield, or your squire carried a banner that would bear your device. But now you can put it on the side of your carriage, and you start to have major competition within the elite to have fancier and fancier vehicles. They're not driving the vehicles. You hire servants to drive the vehicles, although by the 19th century they start to drive the vehicles. But you put your coat of arms on the vehicle, and you have your servants who are driving and caring for the horses wear the colors that are appropriate to your house. So you're getting a level of symbolic competition that is new, but one that sticks with us. I mean, the idea of social competition to taking the form of what do you ride in, what do you drive, begins now in the 1600s and continues down to the present day. So it is a social and status and essentially popular culture outcome that really begins with changes in the way you use gunpowder on the battlefield. Because the knights could not have ridden in a vehicle 200 years earlier, but now they can, and now they compete. Well, how do they compete? You can, at the tail end of knighthood, you can compete by jousting. But as you move along, you can compete by racing your vehicles. NASCAR essentially becomes a conceptual possibility starting in the 1600s. So when I rewrite this chapter, there's going to be a lot about technological change and environment that's not there now, because these are things that not only happened then, but have had long-lasting effects in shaping not simply later European society or American society, but actually world society. The whole notion of highway systems, of roads, being an important point of definition in what constitutes a culture. Where do your highways go? Let's say you have a national, in the 1500s, at the end of the wars of religion, you had what political scientists think of as the birth of the nation state. The idea that instead of having a kind of vague and poorly defined frontier between two different political entities that are radiating out from some capital city or some palace, you get the idea that the states will border one another in a specifically defined fashion with border posts and guards and so forth, and you will go from one state to another at a crossing point. And that makes a great deal of sense to political science as a great turning point in world history. But it also, of course, has great implications for something like transportation. once you decide that you have a state, then how do you build your roads? Do you connect them across the border, or do you keep them within your country? Do you use your road system to make your provincial outlying areas more easily contacted by the capital? Or do you use them for some other purpose? This is not happening yet by the 1600s, but it eventually happens that the road networks and the railroad networks become the part of the defining character of the nation state. Now, one thing I should point out here is that these four-wheeled vehicles, the carriages, that were primitive in design before 1400, but become more and more sophisticated until they become suitable for elite private use. These four-wheeled vehicles don't exist anywhere else in the world at that time. There are no four-wheeled vehicles in China, no four-wheeled vehicles in India, no four-wheeled vehicles in Japan, no vehicles at all in the Middle East, and in most of the most of the areas that become part of the European colonial world, for example, Latin America, you don't have any four-wheeled vehicles. The reason for this is because four-wheeled vehicles don't make much sense. You can't steer them without a lot of technical complication. But even more, every axle you add multiplies the amount of friction you have. So the more wheels you have, the harder it is to pull. So that through most of history, if you had a fixed source of power, such as a pair of oxen or a pair of horses, if they were pulling a four-wheeled vehicle, they would be able to pull less weight than if they were pulling a two-wheeled vehicle. So other parts of the world knew about four-wheeled vehicles and said, we don't need them. We want two-wheeled vehicles. Now, if it was a ceremonial vehicle, that's something else. For example, the great movable temple in eastern India known as the Juggernaut, which was before the Marvel Comics invented a character named Juggernaut. The Juggernaut was a huge mammoth temple on wheels that could only go straight. It couldn't be turned. And if you fell in front of it, or if you were a devotee and you threw yourself in front of it, you would be crushed by the Juggernaut. The only image I've been able to find of the wheel assembly of a Juggernaut was interesting. It had 18 wheels. No two of them on the same axle. Each one on a separate axle. And so you do get ceremonial vehicles that will be more than carts. But any kind of economic efficiency calls for a two-wheeled cart until you get to these developments between 1400 and 1600 that develop steering, brakes, suspension, and things like that. Now, the reason this is important is that all modern motor transport assumes a four-wheeled format, with the exception of motorcycles and a few other odd vehicles. But basically, the idea is that you take a carriage and you take away the horses and the oxen and you put an engine on it. How do you rate the engine? By horsepower, because it's taking the place of the horses. It's very good for traffic because it's exactly half the length of the horse-drawn vehicle. In other words, here are your horses. And once you take away the horses, now you have twice as much room on the street. But that's quickly filled up because everybody gets a vehicle. So four-wheeled vehicles are the vision of the future in the European early modern period that nobody has recognized, because nobody's asked the question of why did no one else have four-wheeled vehicles? And this is a puzzle. I believe that the answer is that, at least this is judging from images of four-wheeled vehicles in the Roman Empire and in medieval sources. There aren't many images, but you have probably a dozen or 20 or so. And they almost all show that they're passenger vehicles, not cargo vehicles, and they carry women. It's because the man won't ride in a vehicle. The man will ride on a horse alongside the vehicle. He won't ride in the vehicle. And the women are always depicted, in the ones I've seen, as women of high status. In other words, a queen and her retinue, a princess and her maidens, upper-class women. So that introduces the question of how do people move classy women in different parts of the world? You know, you can't say, you know, Princess, honey, you know, take a horse over to the neighbors and borrow a crown because she's going to be waylaid and raped, and that'll be the end of your dynasty. So you say, you go over and borrow a crown, and I'll send 12 men along with you to keep you from being waylaid and raped. It is interesting that in Thomas More's Utopia, it's a 14th century work, he says that when the citizens of Utopia go from one town to another on some sort of official errand, they are issued a vehicle by the town to carry them on their embassy, unless they have no women with them, in which case they ride their horses. Because the only reason you would ever have a vehicle is if you have to move a woman of high status someplace. Now, you could move her in a sedan chair. This was, you know, you have 8 men carrying a chair on the shoulder, and a woman and her girlfriend can be sitting inside, and you can be carried around. And that's what they did in China. That's what they did in Japan. In fact, the Meiji emperor, who is associated with modernization of Japan, never went anywhere in Japan in a wheeled vehicle. He was carried in a sedan chair everywhere he went throughout his life. But basically, high status women are hard to transport. So what you get is, in most parts of the world, the women are confined at home. They're kept in the home. They don't move. And the men move. And if they need sex while they're traveling, they bring a boy. That's what boys are for. So we have all sorts of evidence of this, where, you know, the knight and his squire, I mean, please. How many of these squires simply shined the armor and, you know, fed the horses? You might find a trollop at a wayside inn, but if you weren't that lucky, there's always a squire. But if you, so in most parts of the world, women are secluded. Europe does not seclude its women. So Europe kept an obsolete, not an obsolete, but an inefficient form of transport that could not be used in a city, primarily for the purpose of carrying high status women across the countryside. So it turns out that the sort of the primitive character of European society that chose to treat high status women differently than other societies laid the groundwork for technological developments that give Europe a unique set of technical developments that lead to Europe becoming the place where modern motor transport, whether by steam or by internal combustion engine, where they develop. So it's one of those issues where the history of gender gets overlapped with the history of transportation and gets into the entire history of vehicular culture. So that is the aspect of technology and the environment that I hope to introduce to this chapter, but at what cost? You know, I count how many words is it going to take me to explain this. It's only taken me an hour to do it today, but supposing I only have 250 words, what do I take out? I'm afraid Henry VIII may have to go. Hate to say it, but no, Henry's perhaps had his moment, and I've had mine, so that's the end of today's lecture.